Their parents had Ethan and his father Richard were sitting at the dinner table, the way they did most Sundays, the smell of his mother's cooking still hanging in the kitchen, when Richard set down his fork and asked the question he'd clearly been circling for months. "Son, why don't you seriously think about buying a house?" Ethan didn't even look up right away. He kept pushing food around his plate for a second, like he'd heard this question enough times to know exactly where it was going. "Dad, I can't afford it." Richard shook his head, the way he always did, when he thought Ethan was overthinking things, or being a little too cautious for his own good. "I was making less than you when I bought my first house. Less than you make right now, and I still made it work." Ethan pulled out his phone without saying anything, opened a mortgage calculator, typed in a number slowly, almost like he wanted his father to watch it happen. $600,000. Then he pulled up his salary on another tab, right next to it, and turned the screen toward his father so he couldn't look away from either number. "You made less. But your house didn't cost this much. Not even close." Richard stared at the screen for a long moment and didn't say anything. His mouth opened slightly, like he was about to respond, then closed again. That one sentence explains one of the biggest financial divides between generations in America today. Go back to when Richard was young, starting in his first serious job in the early 90s, fresh out of a state school, with a degree that hadn't cost him much, and a job offer he was genuinely excited about. His salary wasn't impressive by any stretch, modest, even for the time. But his path felt simple, almost obvious, laid out in front of him like a straight road. Get a job, save steadily, buy a house, pay down the mortgage, build equity. For Richard's generation, a home wasn't just a place to live. It was the primary engine of wealth, the thing that quietly did most of the heavy lifting in the background of an otherwise ordinary life. Every mortgage payment chipped away at the principal and slowly built equity underneath him, month after month, without him having to think about it too hard. Home values climbed over the decades that followed, and almost without trying, without any clever strategy, his net worth grew alongside them. Now cut to Ethan. Same dream, same ambition, completely different math waiting for him. Ethan earns a solid salary, the kind that would have sounded genuinely impressive to Richard back when he was Ethan's age. But the moment that paycheck lands in his account, it starts disappearing almost immediately. Federal and state taxes take their cut first, before he even sees the money. Then rent, which climbs a little more every time his lease renews. Health insurance, a car payment, and the insurance that comes with it, because in most American cities, you simply can't function without a car. Student loans that never seem to move much, no matter how long he's been paying them, month after month, like running on a treadmill that never stops. Groceries that cost noticeably more than they did, even a few years ago. Utilities. By the end of the month, Ethan is left with maybe $300 or $400, if he's lucky, and some months even that disappears into something unexpected. "I'm not buying luxury stuff, Dad," Ethan said, his voice a little tighter than before. "I'm not eating out every night. I'm not buying new cars. I'm just trying to keep up." Richard looked genuinely confused. Not dismissive, actually confused, the kind of confusion that comes from someone who has never had to run these particular numbers. Like the math simply didn't compute for him, no matter how many times Ethan explained it. And this is exactly where these conversations usually go wrong, all across the country, at dinner tables just like this one. Some people say millennials just spend too much on coffee, on subscriptions, on things their parents never had and never needed. Others say the entire economy is broken, and none of it is anyone's personal responsibility at all. The real answer sits somewhere much more complicated than either side wants to admit, somewhere in between the two arguments, made up of a dozen smaller truths instead of one convenient headline. Look at Richard at 30. Home prices relative to his income were manageable, sitting at a ratio that made sense on a single decent salary. His mortgage was a stretch, but a reasonable one, the kind you could grow into over a few years. College had cost him relatively little, paid off within a couple of years of graduating. He was already saving by then, already starting retirement contributions through his employer, already, without fully realizing it, several steps ahead on a path that would compound for the next 30 years. Now look at Ethan at 30. Home prices, relative to his income, are wildly out of proportion compared to what his father faced at the same age, stretched far beyond what a single salary can reasonably support. He's paying rent instead of building equity, watching that money disappear every month into someone else's asset instead of his own. He's carrying student debt that Richard never had to deal with, debt that follows him around like a second rent payment. His entry costs into almost everything, housing, education, healthcare, are dramatically higher than what his father encountered. And because of all that, his investing has been pushed back years, sometimes over a decade, compared to where his father was standing at the same age. The problem was never simply about income. It's about the price of the things that actually create wealth in the first place. Ethan pulled up a house listing on his phone and turned it toward his father again. A fairly ordinary, 3-bedroom, 2 streets, over from where Richard used to take him to school. $600,000 for a house that needed a new roof. $600,000? Richard said, almost laughing in disbelief, leaning back in his chair. That's normal around here, Dad. That's not even a nice one. Richard sat back further, thinking about what he'd paid for his own first house, decades earlier, a number that suddenly felt almost embarrassingly small in comparison, though it hadn't felt small at the time. Richard hadn't just bought a house back then. He'd bought an asset before it became dramatically more expensive relative to what people were earning. Because home ownership was never really just about having a roof over your head. It was the first domino in a much longer chain. Equity, then appreciation, then net worth, then borrowing power, then retirement security, each one setting up the next. Ethan wasn't struggling somewhere in the middle of that chain. He couldn't even afford to knock over the first domino. But here's the part of Ethan's story that matters even more than the house itself. And it's the part almost nobody talks about at the dinner table, because it's harder to see and harder to argue about. It's time. If Ethan had been able to start building equity and investing for retirement at 30, the way his father did, that money would have had decades to compound quietly in the background, doing most of the work on its own. But when home ownership gets pushed to 35 or 40 or later, and when retirement investing only really starts after student debt is finally paid down, those lost years become almost impossible to get back later, no matter how much money you eventually throw at the problem. Compounding doesn't care about excuses, good or bad, fair or unfair. It only cares about time, and time is the one thing Ethan can't simply work harder to get more of. Richard wasn't ready to let it go, though. Then save more, he said. From what? Ethan asked, not raising his voice, just tired. Cut the unnecessary spending. I already have, Dad. There's nothing left to cut. Then earn more. I'm trying. I got a raise last year. It barely covered the rent increase. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. It wasn't an angry silence, exactly. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are staring at the exact same problem from two completely different starting points, both of them right in their own way. Richard was remembering what had worked for him, genuinely trying to help, drawing on the only playbook he'd ever known. Ethan was living inside a cost structure his father had simply never had to face, and no amount of advice built for a different decade was going to fix that. Because the truth is, millennial affordability isn't shaped by one single villain. It's shaped by several forces stacking on top of each other all at once. Housing prices have grown far faster than wages over the past few decades, pulling further away from what a typical income can support. College costs and student debt have delayed early wealth building for an entire generation, sometimes by a decade or more. Interest rates can swing affordability dramatically in either direction, turning the same house into a completely different monthly payment depending on when you buy. Healthcare and insurance now eat up a much bigger slice of monthly income than they used to. Retirement systems and employer benefits looked very different when Richard was starting out compared to what Ethan has access to now, with pensions all but disappearing. And underneath all of it, the simple math of compounding means that starting late doesn't just cost you a few years. It can cost you an enormous amount of long-term growth that no amount of catching up later fully replaces. Later that evening, Richard went digging through an old filing cabinet in the garage and pulled out his original mortgage statement from decades earlier. The paper yellowed at the edges. He set it in front of Ethan and just looked at it for a moment, running his thumb along the top of the page. "I always thought I was just better with money," Richard said quietly. He paused, longer than usual. "Maybe I was also lucky with when I started." That wasn't Richard giving up or admitting defeat. He had worked hard, and that part was real, and nobody was taking that away from him. And Ethan wasn't off the hook either. He still had control over his own choices and habits, and that mattered too. But financial outcomes were never shaped by effort alone. They're shaped by effort colliding with the economic environment you happen to walk into, at the exact moment you walk into it. Later, the two of them went for a walk outside, the way they used to when Ethan was a kid, down the same street they'd walked 100 times before. "So what are you going to do?" Richard asked. "I can't afford your life," Ethan said, and it didn't come out bitter, just honest. Richard nodded slowly, looking straight ahead. "Then don't copy mine." He paused again, choosing his next words more carefully than usual. "Build yours." That's the real lesson underneath all of this. The goal was never to recreate your parents' exact financial life, step for step, decade for decade. It's to understand the rules of the financial era you actually live in, and build something that works inside those rules, instead of measuring yourself against a game that no longer exists. Because the American dream didn't necessarily disappear. The price of entering it just changed.